So this discussion is around grid impacts with electric vehicles. And as you're all likely well aware, we're looking at massive electric vehicle growth in the coming decades. The projections that we've got are really only accelerating. In 2019, BNEF projected by 2040 that 54% of all vehicle sales would be electric. That projection was one-upped last June. ExxonMobil's CEO projected 100% of auto sales would be electric by 2040. We also saw California adopt a requirement for all new light-duty vehicle sales to be electric by 2035. And they accelerated their medium and heavy-duty requirements under the Clean Fleets rule. Just this February, the proposal is for 100% of medium and heavy-duty vehicles to be electric by 2035, or sorry, 2036. So these goals are accelerating in large part because electric vehicle performance and customer acceptance is higher than has been forecasted in a lot of these early projections. The vehicles that are coming out are great. I don't know how many folks in this room drive an EV. Pretty good. Are thinking about it for your next car? Okay, hopefully the rest of you, great. Yeah, I'm a new driver this year. They're fantastic. We're seeing the OEMs are getting more and more excited about them. Some great Super Bowl ads this last Super Bowl. Also maybe unintentionally bad Super Bowl ad from Dodge Ram with their premature electrification theme. But yeah, lots of excitement and investment from the OEMs. And that is translating to a significant acceleration of load impacts on our systems. California is projecting by 2035 a 25% increase in total retail sales just associated with transport electrification. For SMUD, we're looking at 40% by 2040. Those levels of growth are faster than all but our fastest expansion periods as a grid in terms of annual energy sales. And that's not counting any of the other sectors, the building electrification or underlying growth. So it's going to be some tremendous challenges over the next 10 years for distribution impacts, and the 10 years after that, we're going to start to see those challenges really propagate into the bulk system. How those new loads are going to be able to flex and interact with these systems is going to be critical for how big that distribution needs to be, as well as what kinds of grid services and renewables integration we can count on at the bulk system level. And at the same time, just bringing it all the way around, the grid stability also needs to be looked at, and standards need to be propagated for electric vehicle charging and EVs to ensure that we have at least the same level of grid stability, if not better, as we bring on all of this new load. So this panel is going to try to tackle all of those topics together. Got a great panel today. Our first panelist is Andy Eiden from Portland General. He's going to be talking about utility EV forecasting and grid expansion. Andy is a principal planning and strategy analyst within Portland General's sustainability and resource planning team. Mr. Eiden has over 10 years of experience in the energy industry, focusing on distributed resources across both planning and evaluation, and has worked across consulting, nonprofit, and now utility sectors. At Portland General Electric, Andy leads a company-wide effort on DER forecasting, including coordination with load forecasting, IRP, DSP, and power operations, as well as a variety of R&D and research activity with university and industry partners. And I know that's been a topic of discussion yesterday. Andy's going to be teaching a course at the university. I would encourage all of you to rise to that challenge and consider teaching a course at university to inspire our next generation. So welcome, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Obadiah. And yeah, the panel that got me excited was the how to inspire the next generation. So community college, university students, if anybody is a professor or wants to talk, I'm always available. So so just a quick, before I get going, so I do lead our DER forecasting work, and I've been over the last couple of weeks updating our EV forecast. And so true to form for this session topic, Obadiah, you just scared me with California doing what now with heavy duty vehicles by 2036. So might have to update these slides as I get back to the hotel room. But So I'm going to go into just overview of PGE real quick. So we're a vertically integrated utility in the Pacific Northwest. We own our own generation, transmission, and distribution. We have about 900,000 retail customers across a population of about 2 million. And our resource mix here looks like the colors on translation got away from the brand guidelines, but I don't think anyone's here to give me demerits on that. But we're about 35% clean right now. And you can see over here some of the generation and transmission pathways for PGE. We do our own transmission, but we rely heavily on Bonneville for the transmission needs, as well as many other Northwest utilities. So a topic of a lot of conversation, much like the panel this morning, is transmission constraints post 2030. So PGE, we just included a transmission constraint in our IRP that is the first entry point into sort of more holistic integrated planning. And along those lines, we're also quickly decarbonizing. So we have now a state mandate to do 100% emissions free by 2040 and some pretty robust targets to get there. So 80% by 2030. So everybody's focused right now on the operational, how do we get to 2030, but the resource planners are also, how do we get to 2040? And there's as you retire those last, as you all know, the last mile or so, so to speak, metaphorically, is very difficult. So you're ramping down your fossil base load and exponentially increases your renewable needs. So I put these in here just to show that at the same time, we're going to look at load forecast increases from electric vehicles. We have a decarbonizing system. So a lot of the challenges of balancing load and generation that has been talked about at the conference so far. Just some overview. I'm going to hit these first slides pretty quick because of time. So it's just a couple high level things of what's the context in Oregon. We have a Senate bill that sort of set the stage early on for the role of the electric utility. So that was helpful because there's often a lot of cajoling amongst the stakeholders and who's going to own the chargers, who's going to own the make ready, this and that. So the legislature saw that activity and sort of put in place some pretty clear roles and expectations for providing electricity as a transport fuel. And we're on our third now, just about to file this year, our third iteration of a transportation electrification plan. And then these next ones are just early on, the kind of focus at PGE was provide public infrastructure like public charging here. So we have a series of DC fast chargers that kind of went in before, this was before the VW settlement for the Electrify America rollout. And Tesla was still using their sort of proprietary supercharger network. I know that might change soon. But we've done some activity like this, as well as supported school buses and electrifying those fleets, but we're pretty early on. We don't have a whole lot of school bus electrification happening, but we see that increasing, especially with the IRA and increased incentives there. And then transit was another big focus. So we had some early pilots to work. We have about TriMet, who's the largest regional transit provider, is about 700 buses in our service area, and they have an emissions-free plan. The challenge is, even with our most gung-ho customer here, asking them, so how many buses and on what year are you going to electrify? And then the question is always met with a shrug, or we're thinking about it, or COVID especially threw off these customers. The wind right there is just for a little context. So we own this. It's an overhead charger, 450 kilowatts en route charging, and it's all wind powered. So they electrified this fleet or going on a certain route, and we had to be different. So we had to be the first in the nation at something. So we found out we weren't the first electric bus route, but we were the first wind powered electric bus route. So don't ask me what that means because I was not there when they cooked up the numbers, so I can't speak to it. But we're certainly seeing a lot of interest, and we also have Daimler Trucks North America, who's headquartered in Portland. So we have a partnership with them to do demonstrations of public fast charging for heavy duty vehicles, looking at different charging providers and different interoperability requirements of those vehicles, as well as putting solar and storage kind of on site to try to mitigate and study potential impacts on the grid. I saw that Duke Energy and Daimler seem to want to outdo us, and now they're doing one in North Carolina with first of its kind public fast charging for heavy duty with a microgrid. So they got us there, but I'll transition now into a little bit of what I do, which is sort of try to predict what all is happening in the future with these. I think I think Elaine mentioned it yesterday, the Imagineers. So like proud member of the let's pretend that this will happen in the future committee. It's really fun at the utility as we're in transition. I find it to be really exciting until I have to like present the results to leadership and then stand behind them. So, but I'm going to talk a little bit. Sorry about the light gray on the top there, but so we built at PGE a forecasting model a couple of years ago. We issued an RFP that sort of sought to advance our tools, and we recognized that external driven studies that we only saw the high level outputs was kind of not cutting it anymore. So I'm just going to run through the high level steps here. This is a Python based model that we're leveraging a lot of open source tools, like some from NREL and some from other sources. But the whole point is to drive towards, on the right hand side here, locational DER adoption. So we start with a segmentation of all of our customers. So those 900,000 plus customers, we put them into this model. So it is a true like bottoms up hybrid model. And then we kind of specify the DER measures, including vehicles, chargers, but also other flexible loads, demand response, and solar battery storage, and on the whole sort of demand side mix. And then we put it into a stock turnover. So we're tracking each year the sales and retirements. And then with the market shares, like Obadiah was mentioning, how many of those are going to become electric. And then we kind of put that through some economic screens and ultimately have some disaggregation algorithms to put it down to the feeder level. So I'm just going to talk about the context a little bit and then highlight some of the challenges that we're seeing as this transition kind of quickens. This chart, I think it's actually just to take a step back for a minute. I think we've been seeing a lot of long run national scale studies, and those are great. We need those for good policy making and decision making. What I'm kind of talking about, and I think what Sergio is going to talk about from SoCal Edison's point of view, is I just avoided a metaphor, but I guess I'll say it now, is the rubber hits the road. There it is, with like distribution planning. So we're not looking at necessarily what's a theoretical pathway to either a decarbonized system or high EV growth. It's now both, and we have to build for it really quickly because that 80% by 2030 is 6.5 years away, and with supply chain constraints, you know. So just that's a little context, but this type of chart, I had to strip off the y-axis just because I haven't shared this with internal leadership yet to get approval. So the numbers, just trust me, are large. But what I wanted to show is this is all reference case. So we typically do scenarios in planning. So we'll say, well, we don't really know. So let's do a bunch of either technical potential or high, low, everything you could think of. But this just shows a steady increase in the reference case because that's typically what reverts back to decision making. So at utilities and amongst PUCs, like, well, I guess it differs by PUC. I won't comment on that. But at utilities, like, you're not going to go out and update your financial forecast and what you're telling investors and different things based on something that's like a huge what if. But this is kind of showing us that basically each time we update this forecast, our high case becomes our reference case on the next run. And that's pretty much in line. I mean, Obadiah mentioned a few, but yeah, Bloomberg and other outfits as well. Every time they're updating these forecasts, it's like, oops, we were low again. Let's just keep ratcheting that up. The one on the right really scares me and keeps me up at night. So the heavy duty vehicles, it's a lot higher this time just because we did a little more digging on the last iteration of the model and looked a little harder at out of state registered vehicles and how many are passing through the territory. So PGE has been part of the West Coast Clean Transit Collaborative, which I think SoCal and a number of SMUD and a lot of others are part of, looking at electrifying the entire I-5 from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. And so we do have some high level, again, like let's do some public charging at 50-mile intervals. But then what we're looking at here is owner operator, or I guess like fleets for hire that might be registered in Indiana but are coming through, and it's hard to tell, like, are they actually like going to charge here, or are they just passing through? So that heavy duty is what I'm going to kind of focus on as I have to hand off this forecast to our T&D planners, because what I wanted to convey is explicitly I got direction from our T&D director to basically say, look, I want a forecast I can build on. I don't want a number just to have a number. And so for me, I mean, as someone who deals in made up numbers all day, like that's what my wife says. I have a higher standard, but I guess she's not wrong. So it's a little more challenging, and that's why it's like I want to make sure that I'm double, triple checking these numbers to be like, is that a data error? Is that like a registration, like vehicle error? Do we have the load profiles right? Like when we translate this from vehicles to load impacts. And so I won't spoil it. I have some more like worries on the last slide that I'll turn over, and then the folks doing the research can actually help us think through this. But this is a little bit, just a slide real quick on how we're breaking out the segmentation of our propensity model. We have this model called Adopter, and it's doing premise level adoption calculations based on propensity scoring. We're using a simplified like scorecard based approach rather than a super complex algorithm, just because we have to scale it up to 800,000 customers, and we run it for a full 20-year planning cycle. So we're doing a lot of calculations, and we're not doing full agent-based, decision making, but we're trying to do a blend. So we take into account things like number of EVs in the neighborhood, because that has in the literature some impact, and other variables. So we test those on like a training subset, and then we sort of scale it to the service area. And we kind of just go into quantiles here, and we break into the low and high adoption here, taking the top-down estimate and putting that on the feeders. And then we look at the shape. So right now we're kind of using a mix of things. EV Pro Lite, we're leveraging that for certain types of charging, residential and workplace, where we didn't have a lot of visibility into this. And now as we have so PG now has a smart charging program where we're starting to look at, we have 1,000 or 2,000 customers in a program where we can get access to the telematics data from the vehicle or the charger. And so these will be updated, but for what we have right now, it's kind of a repetitive shape, held constant over the week, but we do incorporate weekend and weekday. But we're looking to really get more realistic on different fleet use cases. And then we, based on that propensity modeling, we kind of come up with feeder level allocation. And not to read into the chart too much, but it's a function of sort of our DMV registration data, as well as that stock turnover. So these are medium and heavy duty vehicles in the image. And so wherever this is from our last forecast iteration, so wherever those happen to be registered, and we put those forth into the model, you get these results, and they're relatively evenly spread. There's not a lot of hotspots you can see. I know the color scheme is not the best for hotspots, but it's a little tricky to show. We're kind of coloring the whole feeder the same, but that feeder is actually somewhat dispersed in the outer edges of the service area. But essentially, we're looking to start here. This was what we did a year ago, and now we're trying to improve it. And well, this was an odd spot, I realized. But once we take those load profiles and get it through our model, we also develop 8760 load impacts. And so what this shows is in 27, if I can work this thing. So 2027 and 2050 on the left and right of each column, and then on the left-hand side, we're calculating baseline load. In the middle is the DER impact shape. And then on the right is the net load. And it's a typical months going down the y-axis here and hours going across the x. And so what you can kind of see is that in, especially in 2050, you got a lot of heat map here with overnight EV charging. So we're forecasting the baseline EV profiles, but then we also, to what Elaine and Luke will talk about, we're also estimating some impacts from managed charging and shifting that load. This is kind of, 2050 is a bit far out, but certain folks like our standards engineering teams really want to know, because they're putting in assets that could last that long or longer. And then translating that, a couple slides left, translating some of that forecast work then into what the T&D decision makers need to do for planning their capital portfolio. This is a reiteration in some respects, but just to highlight, we're just seeing increasing customer interest. It's not always like I'm definitely going to buy these trucks and put them in at this timeline. It's usually a soft what if I did 25 trucks or 50? And then we kind of go back to the drawing board and say, maybe that'll take 3 to 5 years for a substation addition or cost X amount of dollars. And then we typically don't hear from that customer for a while. So we're trying to get better at when they come in the door the first time. How do we say, here's your different options, tell us what you want to do, how you're going to manage your fleet, some of those more advanced managed charging conversations. But and then there's the clean trucks rule, which apparently I've got to update now, because Oregon follows pretty closely on California on that. So I think and I think a number of other states will start adopting that as well. So yeah, going up to 100% by 2036, that's not going to be fun for me. But and we also have the, as I mentioned, the West Coast Clean Transit. So looking at these large charging hubs that are for interstate commerce for these big trucks. I mean, we just saw the Tesla Semi, I think, is going to roll out pretty soon, if it's not already out there. And others will keep increasing in the charging demand. So 5 megawatts may end up being conservative. I don't know. But if you get towards that's at least going to be 3.5 megawatts at start. And then as more vehicles need to charge their, building out, and then that gets into the territory of adding transmission and all the rest of it that we just talked about. And I think Joe's going to speak to, I guess, transmission impacts on reliability. So we're definitely keeping an eye on that. We're more in the R&D space, keep, seeing what might happen there, but it's definitely, those ones won't be built until a customer commits to say, I want it on this intersection or, this truck stop. It's kind of hard to tell your planners like, well, it might be in 3 or 4 places where you have to build a 25 megawatt site. So really hard to get ahead and get the timelines right. And then the last bullet there is we really are struggling with DMV matching that to where the depots are. And so to that note, I don't know, I saw Jeremiah, I think, in here from EPRI, but we're working with Jeremiah and team at EPRI and some other utilities to look at leveraging some telematics data to get better at seeing where they're actually at versus relying on that static DMV registration set. So this is going to make it into our current update. We had to make some simplifications. We're not using, like, I know some of the tools that the labs are working on are looking at super sophisticated, physics-based modeling, and we're not there yet. We're just kind of saying, let's get the number of vehicles right in the locations we think they're going to be, and then use our, at the end of the day, my planners are still using static peak hour, load flow on the distribution side. So it's not really worth going into too much optimization at this point, but we want to be ready for when that is more of a need. 20 seconds for my last thing. It's still orange. Is that cool? Okay. 20 seconds for like a lot of risk and headache here, unfortunately. So I'm just going to jump to the last 3. So there's still a lot of uncertainty. Debbie, you mentioned yesterday the cost allocation, and just like in my experience in Oregon, we've had a distribution system planning process for over 3 years now, just on the first plan iteration. But the hard conversations about this always get kicked out to like, oh, that's a different docket, or like it's a can of worms. But until we actually tackle those like rate reform issues and cost allocation and interconnection stuff, it's going to be difficult to move forward. We also have to start planning for non-wire solutions as a matter of course in Oregon with distribution system planning requirements. And we think for TE, that's going to have a particular potential benefit because those customers are wanting to move very quickly and they don't have timeline to wait for grid upgrades perhaps. And you don't necessarily need to perhaps defer the entire grid upgrade, just get you a little more assurance that you don't have a violation. And then do we need to make DER ready grid investments? Is that like, how does that square with historical practice and what's the cost recovery and prudency risk? Those are what utilities are struggling with. And then I think, I'll leave it to Elaine and Luke to talk more on the EV managed charging, but as a planner and trying to forecast, how do you manage this load with customer programs or tariff design? It's really about getting that value correct and sort of in the framework of each, the problem is in the framework of each regulated distribution utility. And so it's not, it's one thing to have like a general rule, but another to say, how do you apply it?
Awesome. Thank you very much, Andy. Awesome. Thank you, Andy. Our next speaker is Sergio Islas. He's a senior advisor with SoCal Edison's Asset Strategy and Planning Organization. He's responsible for leading technology, process, and strategic initiatives to better manage the grid and support customer needs. Recently, he led a team that studied the grid needs to prepare for transportation electrification. He's a graduate of California State University, Fullerton, and Claremont Graduate University. And his topic is evolution of distribution planning for utilities. And I think his mic is about ready. So welcome, Sergio.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. So I've condensed everything I want to say into 2 pages. So if we need time, just let me know. So we were talking amongst the group here about, for many of us, this is our first conference since sort of COVID. So I don't know how many of you guys, this is your first conference. You can raise your hand. Not too many, but for me it is. Right before COVID hit, I was about to go speak at a conference and then everybody got grounded, so we stayed home. So this is a little bit deja vu for me because now I get to join a conference and be here with you guys and share with you guys what we've been doing at SoCal Edison. So happy to be here. and excited to share what we've been doing in terms of getting ready for transportation electrification. Transportation electrification readiness figure, so don't give me any Winnie the Pooh jokes, please. But we've been thinking a lot about how do we shift our planning approach? So 10 years or so, I was working on what we call a preferred resources pilot. Basically is DERs, and I was leading a lot of the design work and the procurement of DERs for that. We started looking at how do we shape a portfolio of DERs to help offset the need for gas-fired generation. But the planning approach, for the most part, has remained unchanged, and it has worked. But I don't think we can continue to go down the path that we've been planning for the grid. We have a lot of drivers that are requiring that we change our approach. So as you guys are aware, California has some extremely ambitious decarbonization goals, especially in the space of transportation electrification. So we worked on a project last year that I helped to lead that helps us understand what are the grid needs that we're going to have due to transportation electrification. So we also want to look at what are the needs that, from a substation perspective, that have long lead times to develop, where are those going to be needed? And so we wanted to develop a process that basically helped us assess different forecasts, leverage different modeling tools that helps us do time series analysis, identify opportunities for DERs where we can use them, and explore opportunities where we can optimize. And you could probably think or see where I'm going, which is an integrated planning process. I heard a little bit about this yesterday. So this was our thinking for how we want to do integrated planning. And not to say that we have it down. So this is just our initial framework, our initial approach. And it really comes down to three main things. So working from the left to the right. So we want to have the ability to look at different forecasts. So our forecast that we use, it's a forecast that goes through a regulatory process. And it gets given to us by the California Energy Commission. We are a stakeholder in that process, but that's a process that everybody adopts. But from a planning perspective, we want to be able to have the ability to look at more than just one forecast to assess what the needs are at different times. Use different drivers that also look at the customer changes, climate change, electrification changes. So instead of using a single point, we want to be able to have different points. The second piece is being able to assess for multiple needs. How do you assess for capacity expansion, for resiliency, for aging equipment, infrastructure replacement? How do you try to solve also for climate? Be able to have a solution menu that our planners can then use to pick different solutions that essentially helps to address these multiple needs. And then step 3 is the optimization piece, right? Is how do you come up with different sets of solutions and do trade-offs and come up with the best solution in terms of cost-benefit analysis. So like I said, this is the concept we started at the beginning of 2022, and we attempted to carry through this as we assess the grid needs at the distribution level for transportation electrification. As I mentioned, we didn't get everything right, but we're still working through some of these things. So what I want to share with you guys next is our case study of what we did last year and taking that integrated planning approach and what are some of the things we did, what are the results of what we did, and some of the lessons that we learned. So we talked a little bit earlier about the different forecasts. So what you see here, the green light, is the forecast that gets adopted and given to us by our California Energy Commission. There are 2 other scenarios that we look at, and as you can see, both take us to the same endpoint. However, if you look at the blue line and the orange line, you can see that they both have different trajectories, right, in terms of their slopes. And so what that means from a utility planning perspective is we need to be able to get ahead a bit of that work. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot more work to catch up on and to be able to have to do with limited resources. So we talked about resources yesterday, right? So this is one of our concerns is how do we pace the work that we need to do, and how do we do it in a way that is most effective for our customers? And so we looked at 3 different scenarios to help us assess different ways that electrification is going to happen on the grid. And understanding from an aggregated perspective, the overall impact is one thing, but understanding where it's going to happen and how it's going to happen and how much it's going to happen is equally important. So our attempt to try to disaggregate that high-level forecast into more of a bottoms-up forecast, we started looking at the large transportation, large fleets, companies in our territory. And it's the 20/80 rule, right? What are the 20% of the companies that are going to have the largest impact on our distribution system? So we identify those companies, try to understand better where they were going to be, what their trajectory is for electrifying their fleets. We incorporated different studies as well. They looked at different transportation corridors, like Long Beach is close to the port, and other places that would also get electrified. Then we also looked at individual companies that have sizable fleets. Things like dredge companies, truck stops was another place where we looked at. The assumption is that potentially where you have a truck stop, this could be also a place where you might have a depot where you have charging for future trucks. And the deployment of DC fast chargers is also another thing that we incorporated to try to identify where they're connected within our circuitry. And this is a visual representation of where you see some of the larger impacts within our territory. So the red represents where there's a bit more of hotspots, and you can see sort of the shading from red to yellow, where there is a bit less of an impact. But you see the concentration, as I mentioned, down near the ports, out in the 15, that's the connection back to the SoCal to Vegas. You see some of the stuff going on in the 5 as well. So you can see that there's quite a bit of dispersion of need throughout the system. In addition to looking at where we would have potentially locations impacted, the other thing we feel we need to understand better, and we are starting to have a good understanding, but we need more empirical data to make better decisions on this, is just what are the load shapes of TE? We have some assumptions that we made, and the assumptions lead us to believe that most of the charging will happen off peak. But if you see our graph to the right, and I know it's a bit small to see, but we have 2 scenarios where we looked at what happens when you have managed charging and what happens when you have unmanaged charging. And we could talk about what the incentives are and how do you do managed versus unmanaged. But the main idea we wanted to understand is what would happen if everything just goes unmanaged? You see that red line just represents a huge infrastructure investment. So not something that is in the best interest of our customers, and not definitely interest of doing things cost effectively. So we need to figure out a way how to do better, manage the loading from TE. So this represents what we had analyzed. The other, with all of this forecasting work and assessment, we understand where things are likely to happen, but we also understand that there's things that we don't know at this point, right? And so there are instances where there are areas that could potentially be at their nearest tipping point. And so we wanted to assess also what would happen after our 10-year forecast that we use for our planning purposes, if you would have an increased acceleration of the adoption of TE, and where will we have tipping points? You're familiar with this game, which is the only TikTok game that I endorse because I think it's clean. But you've seen the tipping where folks are, just tipping the water, right? And then they're trying to figure out where the water spills. It's essentially what we're trying to do. Where are the locations within our distribution grid where if you just go over a bit more in terms of TE adoption, you'd have a tipping point. So we identified some locations, 20 of those locations that we said, look, even after you expand the capacity on distribution systems, even after you do all the upgrades, you still hit a limit. So from our perspective, what we're saying is once you hit that limit, you run out of time. So we need to start now thinking about what's our land acquisition strategy? Where will we place the additional substations? So we at least want to have the optionality in case that load does materialize faster, then we can move at pace with the market in terms of their TE adoption. Here's a preview of our end analysis. You can see a lot more work on the distribution side and some work on the sub-transmission side. Not to minimize, because we do have quite a bit of work that we identified that needs to happen. Preliminary work still getting finalized. We'll have more in the May timeframe. But here's a visual representation of the different places where we're saying we're going to need to do some work, especially as TE adoption accelerates. And we need to be ready for that. We don't want to get caught behind and not being able to meet our customer needs. A few things we learned, and I'll leave this with you. I think that you won't be, you probably know these very well, so don't want to bore you too much on these, but obviously true performance and data congruency, right? Was talking with the group yesterday about some of the issues we've had with our data, just not talking to each other. Understanding the performance and the cost of DRs continues to be critical as those costs shift. And then understanding upfront, what are the needs from a customer that you're trying to plan for? Is it resiliency? Is it purely reliability? And build that upfront into your planning process so you have a better outcome. And some of the things that we continue to work on internally, the tools to help us accelerate our planning process. So we had a challenge being able to take 2 forecasts, run 8760s and be able to assess them. So that's a challenge and something that we like to overcome. So we'll explore different tools for ways to do that. Looking at load shapes and the charging behavior of customers is another key area that we need to get better at understanding. And then looking at the various impacts from aging assets to climate impact. And then lastly, continue to look for opportunities where DRs can help make improvements to the grid. So just what I wanted to share with you guys. So
Thanks very much, Sergio. Our next speakers, we're going to do a tandem presentation from Elaine, Hale and Luke Lavin, talking about the value of EV managed charging to the bulk power system. So shifting gears a bit from the distribution side, Elaine is going to speak first. She's a senior research engineer in the Grid Planning and Analysis Center at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. She leads teams that develop tools and data and conduct analyses that seek to clarify how future electricity use and future power systems with higher shares of renewable generation could interact to support decarbonization, reduce costs, and increase reliability. And Luke, I'll introduce as well. Luke Lavin is a research engineer in the Grid Planning and Analytics Center at NREL. He develops modeling tools, data, and analyses for valuing the contributions of nascent electricity technologies and uses to future electric power systems. So welcome, Elaine.
Thanks, Obadiah, for the introduction, and thanks to ESIG for the opportunity to present this work. I'm really excited to bring this all to you. The question we're looking at today is, what is the value of light-duty electric vehicle managed charging to the bulk power grid? Now, a lot of people are looking at this question. A lot of people have looked at this question in the past. I think what we really bring here as a distinguishing factor is that we're working with the transportation modelers at NREL to start with vehicle level charging profiles. We're going to be looking at a case study of New England, and we started from 100,000 sample vehicles and estimated their flexibility at that individual vehicle level, and also for a representative week for every month of the year. And what starting at that level lets us do is it lets us really take a deep dive look at what the aggregation process might look like with these vehicles participating in bulk power systems. And that lets us compare the value of different dispatch mechanisms for electric vehicle managed charging. So we're able to compare price responsive mechanisms like real-time pricing and time of use tariffs to direct load control of large aggregates in the bulk power system. And we're also able to look at the difference between within session charging and within week charging, which I think also distinguishes this work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Luke to give you the deep dive into what we found.
Great. Okay, so I'm Luke, and like Elaine said, I'm one of the many contributors on this work that we've been doing here at NREL over the last year. So I'm going to do a deep dive into the modeling first, because as a modeler, I found this part the most interesting, and then we'll get to the results of the study. So in terms of the modeling, one of these is gone. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is actually start with an example. So the issue with doing something like direct load control is that, an L2 charger is what, 7 kilowatts? That's really small to the bulk power system. Often ISOs say that you have to have 100 kilowatt aggregations to participate at all. In practice, if everybody had a 100 kilowatt battery that had SOC that had to be monitored, that'd be quite a difficult problem. So we need to aggregate up electric vehicles if we want to use them as a flexibility resource that participates directly in markets, right? They're not just responding to prices here. So what I'm going to do is give you a simple example, as simple as I could come up with, of two vehicles and what goes on and why this aggregation problem is challenging. Okay, so on the top, you have a vehicle. He goes out driving early in the morning. He comes back. He plugs into his L2. He charges up to full. Great. That's the optimal thing to do if the price is lowest in this example between 8 and 12 a.m. Okay, second example, that EV goes out and starts driving later in the day and can't take advantage of the very lowest price period. So instead has to charge in the second and third lowest price period in order to minimize the cost of charging. Okay, great. These two vehicles, it's simple. As long as we set the prices to them, no problem. But what happens when we try to add up their power and energy bounds to create a battery-like resource that aggregates these two vehicles and is represented as one object to the system operator? This is where issues can ensue if we're not careful about the math. Okay, so now, instead of each vehicle having an 100% state of charge, I'm showing you on the y-axis here, it can go up to 200. We're just going to assume that these vehicles have the same parameters, but that again, the first one goes out driving first. The signal gets sent to it. It gets charged up. It's still plugged into the grid, right? But if the grid operator saw this aggregate resource, let's say that each EV is an 80 kilowatt hour battery, right? If the grid operator was like, oh, great, they're both plugged into L2s. There's these 8 kilowatts, 80 kilowatt hours. I have this 160 kilowatt hour resource that's only half full because of the first charge vehicle. And I can send it a 16 kilowatt signal, right? Because they're both plugged into chargers. No, you can't, right? Because the first vehicle is already fully charged. So there's no way to disaggregate that 16 kilowatt signal between the two vehicles if each one is plugged into 8 kilowatts and the first one was already fully charged earlier. So what we say here is you cannot use the naive aggregation, right? You can't just add up the power and energy bounds of heterogeneous electric vehicles that are plugged in at different spots on the grid and treat them as if they're like an aggregate battery resource from either the naive or outer approximation. So that infeasible signal would be not possible to fulfill. So in practice, it's hard to say exactly what would happen, but perhaps that second vehicle would just charge the same way that it was going to before. But is it a problem that that signal wasn't fulfilled? How should we represent these aggregate resources to the bulk system? And the question that comes up for me here is, how feasible does this mean direct load control is? Like, how accurately do we need to estimate the actual flexibility of the aggregate resource and how easy it is to disaggregate a signal that's sent to hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of electric vehicles into individual charging for all of those vehicles. So this is kind of the question that we started looking at analytically on this project. And I'm just going to show sort of illustrative results here that I think get at the main modeling finding before we roll through the specific results. So on the y-axis here, you're going to see the net revenue. Just call it net. You know, if it's V1G, you're charging an electric vehicle. There's always going to be a cost associated with that, but it'll be lower if you charge it at the lower price times, right? So the net revenue just means that, oh, if I charge at lower price times, I save some money. And then the concept of the error on the x-axis is what I was getting at earlier, right? Like in that 2-vehicle example, if you send a signal that cannot be fulfilled by the vehicle because the other one's already been charged, then you have some error, right? Where like you have this unfulfilled signal that like the ISO asked for that can't be fulfilled. So in what we call the naive aggregation case, where you just add up the power and energy bounds of thousands, hundreds of thousands, up to millions of vehicles, what we end up seeing is that those vehicles can sometimes think that they can achieve a level of net revenue that when we dispatch them all individually is actually just like not possible. Like, how could you possibly get more revenue from aggregating up 100 vehicles than you got from their optimal profile individually, right? And this is because that outer approximation is being represented to the system. In practice, we see even a little bit more infeasibility of the naive aggregation. And so this leads us to the question of, okay, instead of just taking the outer naive approximation, adding up the power and energy bounds and representing the EVs as a single flexible battery-like object to the grid, would there be a better way to scale those bounds to come up with sort of more feasible representations of the electric vehicles? So we come up with 2 different scenarios for doing direct load control that we call our highest net revenue and our low error scenario. So the low error essentially just means that the signal that's sent to the aggregate can actually be mostly or almost entirely fulfilled by the individual vehicles once it gets disaggregated by our dispatch algorithm behind the scenes. And then the highest net revenue, right, just means, okay, like you might still be missing a little bit, but from an aggregator's perspective, assuming that you have to buy back the position you could not fulfill at the prevailing real-time price in our modeling, that still is leading to the highest net revenue. And what we see there is you want to maintain the outer approximation for the energy bounds, but for the power bounds, you actually do have to scale those to kind of achieve the highest net revenue. And then in the low error, we end up with 50-50-50, at least in many of our tests. And we looked at a number of different scenarios, which, you know, you can always go look at the paper. But I would say that the upshot here, right, is that to get direct load control of electric vehicles, we're seeing that you need to be very careful about how you represent that aggregate to the system operator. Okay, so that's kind of like the high level, like I thought interesting modeling result. Now we can dig into the specifics of the study. So like Elaine was saying at the start of the talk, our study setting is the ISO New England power system in an envisioned 2038 scenario where the grid is much cleaner than it is today. Based on work with our colleagues in vehicles, they have this tempo model where they are incorporating the 2035 target of 100% of sales of light duty vehicles being electric. With stock rollover incorporated, this leads to 45% of light duty vehicles in 2038 being electrified. And then what you see here on the right is, at least based on the constraints of having rectangles, a 67 county array of New England and the load profiles associated with each of those counties. So we have county level resolution in our modeling, and we're using 100,000 sample vehicle profiles to represent the millions of electric vehicles that we forecast to be on the road in New England in 2038. Okay, so these now you'll see here are the direct load control results, and then we'll get into comparing it with price responsiveness, the other dispatch mechanisms. So the thing I want to call out here, well, okay, so on the y-axis, you have the total production costs over a year for the ISO New England system, about $1.5 billion. And then you have our direct load control aggregations in that, as you might recall, the low error scenario where it's almost entirely feasible, the maximum revenue where even if the aggregator has to buy back their position that they couldn't fulfill, they're still maximizing their overall revenue. And then you have that naive approximation. And what we're seeing here is that when we incorporate the infeasibilities and the need to, under our assumption, buy back those positions, you get that little black adder that you see kind of towards the top of those charts. And what that's showing you is that if the aggregator were to represent their outer approximation to the grid, the grid is going to do worse overall because it sends these signals that can't be totally fulfilled than if they were to represent less of their sort of theoretical flexibility to the grid. So that's under direct load control. In all scenarios, like we're saving some costs, there are some benefits there, but it's difficult or impossible to represent the full energy and power bounds of all EVs aggregated as a single resource. Okay, so you might say like, hey, this is a little bit of an issue. Why don't we just represent them all individually by sending prices to devices? So yeah, we thought of that too, and we took a look at it. So I know that folks have a lot of thoughts about this one, so I'm gonna but you can represent individual vehicles to the grid by sending prices to devices. The issue that comes in here that a lot of folks in this audience will be familiar with is, let's say it's a real-time price. There's some exact lowest price period. Everyone wants to charge then. Is it still really the lowest price period? In our simulations, not if you're adding, say, 10 gigawatts of EV charging, which is what you're seeing here in some of these orange spikes, to an ISO New England system that has something like 15 gigawatts of average load and a 29 gigawatt peak load. If you're adding 40, 50+% of the system load, that now becomes a new peak, and that's really hard to serve. So the question then becomes, and this is what, I've received lots of different papers. I'm sure people will send me more after the talk, which will be great, and I'd love to talk about it. How do you flatten out that signal, right? Like if you're sending a time of use rate or something like that, could you randomize some of the charging that happens against that time of use rate? Would that be good enough? How much does it need to be randomized? So what we did in this paper is we apply essentially a ramp penalty to the aggregate resource, and that relaxes it back towards the unmanaged profile and leads to some of the benefits being retained by sending prices to devices that you see under low adoption rates, where you can more easily assume that the aggregate is a price taker, right? Like this problem comes in when a lot of vehicles do this, right? If it's one or two, price taker's okay. If it's thousands or hundreds of thousands, like, we need to have some kind of way of mitigating the sort of rebound peaks, if you will. Okay, so that's the sort of price responsiveness piece. So it's difficult to serve those large, expensive spikes if we can't figure out a way to mitigate them. And we do have some strategies for mitigating, but they don't necessarily sort of perfectly outperform direct load control, which is what we'll see in the next set of results. So the high level results that we get to at the end of the paper, what you're going to see here on the y-axis is the per vehicle bulk power system savings. So that, per vehicle and across the entire ISO New England system in this envisioned year of 2038, 8760 as dispatched in Plexos. And then on the y-axis is the firm capacity savings. So, we have an estimate here of how much less CTs or other resources that serve peak load you would need to build because you now have electric vehicle managed charging that can shift EV load out of those peaks. Okay, so the high level finding here is that at low levels of participation, so you can kind of make that price taker assumption, and you end up seeing that real-time pricing is the most beneficial. It retains the individual flexibility of the vehicles, but it doesn't lead to rebound spikes that are really difficult to serve because only a fairly small number of vehicles are participating. So under those circumstances, we see that what Elaine was talking about with the within week flexibility, so flexing your EV charging across the entire week, is much more beneficial than the within session, only being able to flex it each time that you're plugged in. But the main finding is, that real-time pricing creates a lot of benefits. In this case, when 5% of the 45% of LDVs, so about 2% are participating. 2% of vehicles, sorry. Okay, so with that said, right, the issue we encounter with the price responsiveness is that can we scale it, right? And in terms of scaling up to say 100% of the vehicles participating, and in this scenario, I'd say electric vehicles are now 10, 15% of total load in ISO New England. At least with the methods implemented in our paper, we find that direct load control is the most beneficial to the system. So you know, you do still see the declining marginal value, right? Like as an additional flexible resource goes onto the system, that's less valuable than the resource before it because you've already shifted some load out of the peak and into the valleys. But it's not as bad as having those rebound peaks that you had when we were doing price responsiveness, right? So the high level finding here is that direct load control seems to outperform price responsiveness when you get up to a certain level of participation of electric vehicles in those types of programs, at least in modeling. Okay, so finally, the high level findings from the study. And this is the other part where it's like, okay, like how many folks in this room would accept a payment of $30 a year in order to have their electric vehicle flexed around by the bulk system operator? I guess, you know, we can always send signals or come up with some programs and find out. But I think that, you know, the high level finding here is around $30 a vehicle a year. You know, you can save 5-ish% in our modeling of the bulk power system costs. But I think there's a lot of questions here that'll probably come up in the discussion around, you know, is this going to be worth it? And if so, how do we enable it? And with that, I'll turn it over to Elaine to discuss what comes next as part of this modeling.
Yeah, so we're really excited about the report that's out, but we're even more excited about what's next. So we just started a new project where we're expanding this work in a lot of different directions. On the transportation side, we are expanding into medium and heavy duty vehicles and expanding the flexibility modeling methods to cover those as well. And we also made some pretty big assumptions in this first study about ubiquitous charging availability, and we're really looking forward to looking at realistic deployments of chargers for all the vehicle types and also realistic plug-in behaviors. On the grid side, we just looked at 1 year of operations for ISO New England for this study, but we'll be looking from now to 2050 using our capacity expansion modeling capability with reads for this next piece of work. So that's also really exciting. We just started the project in November, and currently what's really active is the development of modeling on the transportation side and figuring out what scenarios we want to look at. So if you have feedback on what scenarios would be interesting for that kind of study, please let us know. We're actively developing that right now. We're expecting the development work to take about 1.5 years, and hope there's a final study out in about 2 years. But be a lot of work going on between now and then. So please reach out if this is of interest. Thanks.
Thank you again for the presentation. We're going to move to our last speaker now. There's Joe Ito. He's going to be talking about reliability considerations with large-scale EV charging. Joe is a staff scientist at LBNL, where he's a senior advisor for the Electricity Markets and Policy Division and the Energy Storage and Demand Resources Department. He's authored over 250 publications on frequency response, transmission planning, electricity reliability metrics, trends, and value-based planning, synchrophasers, microgrids, energy efficiency, and demand response. Joe has supported the US DOE's Office of Electricity by serving on the US-Canada investigation of the August 14, 2003 blackout, and by assisting in the preparation of DOE's National Electric Transmission Congestion Studies. So welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Obadiah. Y'all can hear me okay? Let me start by seconding Sergio's comment that it's great to see you all in person. It's much more fun looking at you than looking at my screen when I give this talk, which I've tried to do, and much better to see people looking and falling asleep or what have you. But it's great to be here. So thanks very much for having me. People in the electric industry hate surprises. So, a lot of people are here from the IBR community. Blue cut was the surprise they don't like. Okay, and so a lot of work is done to avoid surprise because nobody likes these kinds of surprises, especially when the lights go out. And so I've spent a lot of time investigating blackouts, and I know very well of this. So this paper is sort of attempt to try and get ahead of the game. And so heartened by the experience that we had looking at FIDR, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. A group of us got together, maybe about 7 years ago, and wrote an IEEE paper about looking at what it would be, for electric vehicle chargers to behave in a grid-friendly manner. And the idea was like, why don't we start, before this load gets too big and sort of, we can't control, let's talk to these manufacturers now, before they, have all their vehicles on the road. And so Ryan and I have been going to the Society of Automotive Engineering. This is our peers in the automotive industry. And we've been talking to their standards body, and we found the right group, and we gave this presentation about, how chargers could be grid friendly. And, they said, well, we're all from Missouri, we want you to show us. And so this is the first of a series of studies that we're working on to try to illustrate, what we mean by grid friendly and why we think it's important. So that's the background. This slide we can skip over. This is the one that everyone's talking about, and the point here is that, there's going to be a time in the foreseeable future where in residential circuits, charging could be half the load. So when you're half the load, you have how you behave when the grid is in trouble has a material effect on how the grid is going to respond. And so that's what this study is about, is trying to anticipate those conditions, look at what could happen, and then try to show the manufacturers, why things that some of them are already doing, if they all did, would be very beneficial for all of us. So that's what this study is about. This is so why is so there's a lot of lab people. Why is a guy from LBL talking about a PNL report? It was because we wrote it together, and Frank did all the simulation work, and so he should be the first author. But anyway, we wrote this because we wanted to have a vehicle to begin communicating our understanding about the grid to folks who are, you just plug it in at the house, right? And then the charge up and you go drive around. So this is about opening a dialogue between two engineering communities that have historically never talked. Like these guys on the car side, they've been talking to the oil companies for a long time, about what kind of octane works really good and we have to have that conversation between the electric side and the vehicle side. I mean, this is sort of an opening dialogue that we've started here. So what I'm going to do is talk about a known grid problem called FIDR, which stands for fault-induced delayed voltage recovery. It's a phenomena that another surprise that the industry came across about 15 years ago, when transmission faults cause residential air conditioners to stall. And when they stall, they draw 5 times the reactive current and 3 times the real power. And it really makes, after a fault clears, it's supposed to, voltages immediately back up to what they were controlling them at. But when these things stall, they drag the voltage down to hold it down. And that was a great concern for the industry at the time. So that's a known grid unfriendly load, residential air conditioning. And what we're going to do is do this study where we look at whether electric vehicles, which are charging at the same time that these transmission faults take place, do they make this stalling behavior worse, or do they leave it unaffected, or can they even actually alleviate some of the stalling? And so this is a test circuit that PNL has a bunch of these generic distribution circuits. It's got a lot of air conditioning on it, about 50% of the load is air conditioning. It's about 11 megawatts. And what we're going to do is put electric vehicles of one model or another at every household on this circuit. And then we're going to play in transmission faults. We're going to induce FIDR behavior in this circuit. And then we're going to see whether when there's a combination of both vehicles and air conditioners, how the FIDR changes. How the FIDR effect changes. So here's the obligatory how we did it. P&L's got this great little tool called Grid Lab D. We model the induction motors there. These guys at Idaho National Laboratory did a lot of vehicle testing for us. They built this little state space model. What this model does is as a result of a lot of their tests, tells us, when these vehicles see these faults, some proportion of them do this, some proportion of them go into overcurrent, some proportion go off, and there's all these little states that they'll move into. And so we can really model the behavior of these chargers during these events. And down below is an example of in this table of what the chargers actually do. So given a step change in voltage, some probability of them are going to go into state A1, some are going to go into state A2, and then there's another transition probably from there and there. Anyway, so we're going to merge those two models using this GMLC project called Helix, which allows you to do co-simulation. And we can talk more about the modeling later. I'm going to jump right to the results here. So here's the baseline result. This is a circuit we play in. I'm going to play in a whole scenario of faults of different voltage dips that cause air conditioners to stall and different durations of the voltage dip. And what you see is like at not such a deep dip for a very short period of time, none of the air conditioners stall. But eventually, if the dip is longer in duration or lower in the depth, more and more air conditioners are going to stall. And eventually you get to this condition where this is just one leg of the circuit. 331 is the magic number here. That means every air conditioner on that circuit stalled. And stalling can be seen as following. Here's a 9-cycle dip to 50 to 0.5 PU. That's this one right here, 199 of them. So here's the air conditioners running. The blue ones means it's running. The red ones mean they've stalled. A bunch of them stall. And then some of them restart and go back to running. And then some of them, and then there's then stalled that are left. A longer dip to the same depth causes many more of them to stall. The red lines are at the top, and it takes much longer for the voltage to recover enough so that the air conditioner can restart. This is what we're going to be looking at throughout this little paper here. This is another explanation of what happens. These are the speeds of the individual air conditioners, and you can see them slowing down when the voltage dip happens. Some of them are able to like reaccelerate without stalling. Some of them stall and then reaccelerate. And the reason for why they all behave differently is because they're all in different places in this distribution circuit. And in fact, the further you get from the substation where the voltages are the strongest, that's these ones up here, you get lower and lower voltages and more stalling. So these are the observations at different points within the different nodes, just where the sampling is taking place. And so we'll talk about that quite a bit in these results. So then, the guys at Idaho did a bunch of these lab tests. They found 6 different models of EVs that they tested, and they all behave differently. So I'm showing, boy, this resolution is terrible, isn't it? Can we turn? Well, anyway, there's a little notch here showing the voltage sag, and here's a charger that rides through the sag, but then drops its current draw immediately at the end of the sag and then ramps back up. Here's one that upon sensing the voltage dip drops off for essentially the entire, well, it takes maybe 10 seconds before it starts ramping back up. These are 2 different scales. This is a longer time scale here of up to 15 seconds. This is just in the first 2 seconds of the event that's taking place. Boy, it's really hard to see what's going on. Anyway, some of them ride through, some of them turn themselves off and then turn themselves back on. That's going to be the most important thing that happens here. Okay, let's happen next. So here's an example of the increase in the number of stalled air conditioners from the baseline as a function of the depth of the voltage sag and the duration of the sag. And so what we see here is these are grid-friendly chargers. These chargers, fewer air conditioners stall than in the baseline when these chargers are in operation. Here are the grid-unfriendly ones. Way more air conditioners stall compared to the base case as a result of the way these chargers are behaving during the course of this voltage sag. And so we'll talk about what happens here. So here again is the no electric vehicles. They all reaccelerate. This is with EVB. Where was EVB here? EVB. EVB is this guy here. Turns off at the very beginning. Okay. And so when EVB is there, EVB getting off quickly allows voltages to recover much faster, so they can all reaccelerate. So this is seen by, they all stall, a bunch of them stall, but then they all kind of turn themselves back on. So that's great. That's a grid-friendly EV charger, you know, kind of gets off and lets the grid get itself back together before it turns itself back on. Here's a grid unfriendly one. This is EVA. This one rides through the event. And so what happens is here's the no PE, a bunch of them stall, but they all reaccelerate. This is a way more of them stall and fewer of them can actually restart. And then a lot more of them stay stalled for the entire period. That's the grid unfriendly behavior. So here we go. Now that was at the initial onset of the stall. Now this is like 2 seconds after the fault is cleared. So same ones that were unfriendly before, A, C, and E. Same ones that were friendly before, B and F, but now D has become friendly. What did D do? Let's take a look. So D is one that rides through the fault, but then turns itself off. So the grid is trying to recover. And what you see here is that here's the no PEV again, you know, something go, but by turning itself off at the end of the fault, you know, way more of them stall at the beginning, but then by turning itself off at the end of the fault, it allows them to recover much faster. And so that's a grid-friendly behavior. So we've tried to summarize this as follows. There's 2 phases. During the fault, the grid-friendly ones are ones that immediately cease consuming current. The grid unfriendly ones are the ones that do not cease consuming current. After the fault is cleared, the grid-friendly ones are the ones that delay turning themselves back on for at least a couple of seconds. So this is very important to note. This grid-friendly behavior doesn't mean that it's going to take 2 hours long to charge a car. These are events that happen maybe once in a year, possibly. They last 2 seconds. You know, we think, you know, you could halt charging for 2 seconds, and most people aren't going to really be too bent out of shape by that, especially if the alternative is a blackout, right? So not such a bad trade-off, we think. That's just me speaking here. The grid unfriendly ones are the ones that immediately resume trying to draw current here at the very end. And that's not so helpful because the grid's trying to get itself back together. And again, we're talking about seconds, not minutes, not hours, you know, this is supposedly very minimal impact. Okay, so that's what our findings are. And so, you know, what we're doing is we're showing these to every audience we can talk to, like you all, you know, and talking to the vehicle manufacturers in particular. And, you know, what we're trying to do is, like, the reason we're talking to this SAE group, the Society of Automotive Engineering group, is I have to keep standing to the side because I can't see over the top if I stand behind my computer. So we're trying to talk to these standard setting bodies to try to put in, you know, essentially voluntary guidelines for what is grid friendly, what is grid unfriendly, how do you test it? And, you know, kind of our argument to them is like, look, we're not here to like say you have to do this. You know, we want to like have this dialogue so you understand what we're talking about. So your standards and which are voluntary, quite frankly, you know, have this material in there so that when the time comes and you decide it's a good idea, you don't have to sort of invent it from scratch. And, you know, the sort of hidden messages is like when the blackout happens and you're to blame and the politicians get together and say, this is how we're going to fix this. You know, you can say, oh, we actually have a standard where we actually had engineers talk to each other ahead of time rather than the politicians pretend like they can come on the engineers and tell you what you should do. it's kind of a mess. I've been involved in these blackout investigations. It's a very heated time where people, communication is challenging. And so the idea is advanced communication makes these later communications a little bit easier. So then on our side, on the electric side, we're doing more studies. And so Ryan's got this crack group of guys here. Hopefully they're not sleeping now. Alex and JP, you should talk to them. We've got some models for them to do these bulk grid studies using these EV models. And there's a whole litany of grid-friendly behaviors that we're going to be sort of working through. Voltage sags, frequency control, frequency response, lots of things that many of you are involved in the essential reliability services world will recognize. And so that's where we're going. And so hopefully in your next meeting, Ryan, not me, will be giving this talk, or Alex or JP will be giving this talk, and we'll hear more about some of these bulk power system impacts, and just keep the dialogue going. So with that, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to the discussion.